poetry meets the human voice. I'm Tamara Rockwood. I'm coming to you from Baywatch Island. This is episode 38, and today we are asking, who's afraid of white space on the page? Some, but not all. We are diving into the Baywatch Island Press chapbook, Wildlife, by Amy Wright. Her poetry understands something crucial. Sometimes what you don't say creates the most powerful meaning. White space is not emptiness. It is an invitation. It is a breath. It is where the poem opens up and lets the reader in. We're going to go into this in just a second because it's actually very, very exciting in a very, very nerdy way. But when we're not publishing, my husband Ben and I run Baywatch Island Press, where we publish contemporary poetry. So we see a lot of poems that in the world are afraid of silence, afraid of letting the page breathe, afraid of letting the audience interact with the poem. And today we are celebrating poetry that isn't. So whether you're a longtime poetry reader or you're a skeptic about this whole thing, this conversation is for you. So grab your coffee, grab your tea, find a comfy spot. Welcome to Poetics. So the first poem that we are going to read in this chapbook is, the title is Full Snow Moon. So I'm going to read it and then we will discuss it a little bit. And I encourage you to get the chapbook because this is not only a lovely poem to read, but it is also a lovely poem to see on the page. And today, as I said, we're talking about white space. And maybe I'll talk about white space before I read it because then it'll make a little bit more sense. So the history of white space on a page is not relatively new, but in the grand scheme of the universe, it's relatively new. So it depends on your perspective. But overall, white space was beginning to develop in the 1500s, late 1600s, or late 1500s. That's about when it began to develop. So where do you even begin with this? The purpose of white space was to allow the audience to interact with the work. And this was a development of humanism at the time in literature and in philosophy. And how do we include the human into the work? How do we allow mankind to have a say? Because if you look at the history of literature, there are heroes. There is Homer. There is philosophy. If you study the Greek classical, those are drama. But the inclusion of the reader is actually very, very new. And they're actually, let me find the reference. Okay, there's a book that I'm studying right now. It's called Pause and Effect, Punctuation in the West by M.B. Parks. I don't encourage anyone to buy this book. I am studying, my PhD is the history of the exclamation mark in poetry and its purpose in modernist poetry. So I will read this book for everyone, but it's actually a really, really fascinating book. And so one of the things that it said in here, which makes sense. So with writing, what it's saying is in antiquity, the written word was regarded as a record of the spoken word, and texts were usually read aloud. But from the 6th century onwards, attitudes to the written word changed. writing came to be regarded as conveying information directly to the mind through the eye. And there was an author named Seville, 560 through 636. He could state a reference for silent reading, which subsequently became established as the norm. And this written medium developed as a separate manifestation of language with a status equivalent to, but independent of, any spoken counterpart. So, what's important is, then he says, new conventions, such as word separation, features of layout, and punctuation, were developed to make it easier for readers to extract the information conveyed in the written medium. And that was the invention of readers, where it was all of a sudden understood that you could write without speaking. It didn't need to be an oral tradition. That's a completely different way of writing. Now, of course, there were other ways of writing. When you look at the Torah, it is meant to be spoken aloud, but it's also meant to be read and studied. Same with the law, same with letters. There's a lot of things. But just for the sake of argument, we're going to say that the invention of the reader only is actually a very, very fascinating idea, because all of a sudden it doesn't need to be said. It doesn't need to be coupled with speaking. All of a sudden, writing is something different. It's something separate at using the language. So when you think about the history of writing, it tends to be an overwhelming block of words. When you think of Latin, in long, I don't know what year to reference, but just Latin manuscripts, the development of punctuation was very slow because it wasn't used. And so it was just words and words and words and words and words. And when you look at the Old Testament in Hebrew, it's blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks of words. And the utilization of white space in texts, in poetry, in drama, in scripture, really didn't take hold, at least in England. I think that Italy was a little bit earlier just because they had the Renaissance earlier. And so that was in the 1400s. But in the late 1500s, the use of white space was utilized, and that was a reflection of humanistic integration and philosophy, that the reader was part of the experience of writing. Okay, that all being said, when you think about white space, these days it is utilized in ways that can be confusing. So many times there are people who really want to read poetry. Poetry is part of the fabric of being human. We are poets before we are anything else. Before we learn math, we learn nursery rhymes. Before we learn anything, we learn how to sing. At the beginning of the New Testament, or not the New Testament, there was, but in the beginning of the Old Testament, I'm coming from a Christian perspective primarily with this, just because I'm studying the King James Version Bible, and so that's on my mind. The printing sets of that it's a whole thing. But in the beginning, the way that the universe was created was through song. And you can see this in just about every mythology, is it always begins with song. Even with this was one of my favorites, but in Scottish mythology, in old Scottish pagan mythology, all of the female goddesses were on land. They were in charge of the weather. They were in charge of the land. They were in charge of the harvest. They were in charge of the crops. They were in charge of, the dances. That's what they were in charge of. And destruction, because that's also fun for goddesses. But the men were at sea. The male goddesses. I'm so sorry. The male gods were at sea, and they were poets. The poets were at sea. The poets were the male gods. And that's kind of where sea shanties came from, because if the sailors could remember the songs perfectly and sing them perfectly, then they would have good sea and good wind, because they made the gods happy that they remembered their poetry. So anyways, poetry is part of who we are. And so utilizing the audience makes a lot of sense. But it's also difficult because on one hand, in late 1500s, early 1600s, when people started reading poetry that had white space, they're like, what the hell is this? And it was a desecration of written poetry, because what they were used to was blocks of text that looked overwhelming. And when you recognize something, you're like, yes, this is the way it looks all the time. And when you change the format, it feels like that change is sacrilegious. And so that was one of the problems with the King James Bible, was the publisher was Charles Barker. He was the royal publisher, and he included it into the Bible, and it no longer was the block text of the Bishop's Bible or of the original Hebrew or into the translated Latin or even into the Geneva Bible that also had that just block text, overwhelming format, and all of a sudden it looked like Shakespeare's writing. It looked like a modern drama. You might as well have just printed the entire Bible in Comic Sans and added like comic bubbles above things. It just was so outrageous. And so that outrageousness for protecting the sacredness of poetry, we still feel today. We are still very protective of poetry because it is so important to us. We don't want poetry to be foolish. Now, there is foolish poetry. There is, starts with an S, satire. There is foolish poetry, and that's fine. But when you read a poem about grief, when you read a poem about loss, and it isn't printed in a way that is respectful, then you react against it. So a lot of times when we pick up experimental poetry that everyone tells us, this is great poetry, this is exactly what we're looking, this is just changing my world, and you're looking at it on the page and you're like, I don't even know where to begin. It looks like someone took the poem in their hands and just splashed it on the page, and how do you read that? It's confusing, and we react against that, rightfully so. But I'm here to tell you that it isn't always bad. And so we're going to talk about that. We are talking about that. Okay, so that is saying that when I read Amy Wright's chapbook, there's a lot of white space on the page, but it is masterfully used, and it's beautifully done. And the way that she uses the text and the page and allows and invites the reader into her work is loving. And it was just delightful to read. Her poetry was also delightful, but I wanted to put touch on this because she used it so well. So I'm going to read Full Snow Moon, and then we'll talk about the poem. Full Snow Moon. Last season's tomato vines by the red barn A done knot you carry to low ground, crunch underfoot. As almanacs predicted, this morning, after the full snow moon waxed full, fog clotted the blue ridge, a prophecy of attention to patterns recurrent as morning dove coo intervals. Given time and actinomyces, dead roots will mulch, though not redress, topsoil stripped by erosion, tires, gas lines. Startled doves resettle. Each stamp threatens to breach the thatch, meet a muscle of earth you can pulp red-juiced and salted, candied into sauce. Dry stems crack, open a body of lost names the Tutello gave this land. Minosa moon, Iru te one, warrior, Eta, heen first, the record lost for mountains, vines, morning, song. From the pines, the doves resume their 4 notes, throats thickening before each, coo, oo, coo, coo, a tremolo of tissues that clot the air like clouds mekosi. So this poem opens the collection with a meditation on seasonal decay and indigenous erasure. The speaker reflects on last season's tomato vines decomposing by the red barn, and then shifts to the full snow moon rising over the fog-clotted Blue Ridge. This is prevalent on the east coast of the United States, in West Virginia. I think it's in West Virginia. This poem is moving between mourning doves and soil science. So there's a lot of words in here that I'm like, I need to take the time to figure out how to pronounce this. One of them is actinomyces, and that is a a bacteria that it's a very natural bacteria, but also that's a long word, and I really have to break that down for myself. But it breaks down organic matter, and probably anyone that has a compost pile knows this. But then the poem pivots dramatically to the lost language, the Tutello people, and their words for land, for the moon, for the warrior, and they are now reduced to fragments. And then the poem ends with the dove's 4-note call echoing across the landscape. This poem showcases Wright's ability to layer agricultural observation, ecological knowledge, and historical trauma without heavy-handedness. It is elegant and it is clear. The white space between the stanzas function like the fog-clotted Blue Ridge, the fog-clotted poem, obscuring and revealing simultaneously. When I read this, it was beautiful how Wright moves from the concrete, the decomposing vines that you can see, to the scientific, the actinomyces, and to the historical, to the Tutello. The Sashura gaps that invite the reader make the connections. That is what is brilliant about this, and that is why the white space in this is so crucial, and that's why you need to see it on the page. It's beautifully done. The poem's structure mirrors its content. The fragmented language for a fragmented people. Lines like of lost names. It's using the white space to enact erasure. what is missing from the page becomes as meaningful as what is present. The mourning dove's 4-note call provides both a literal sound and a metaphorical repetition, these patterns that persist even when meaning is lost. There are 3 huge strengths in this, besides the white space. So the ecological and historical layering. This is a seamless braid in this poem of scientific vocabulary and indigenous history, and it's showing how land holds both biological and cultural memory. The poem doesn't explain these connections. It trusts the white space to let the readers feel them. And this is why printing is so important. This is why I publish. This is, if we don't write these poems down, if we don't publish these poems, no one will read them, and we will forget who we are. Which is devastating. And so I was just so happy to read this. I'm so glad that Amy Wright sent this to me. She gets published in many other places, so I'm not worried about her. She's very, very talented. But another one is the sonic architecture of this. The morning calls function. The repetition is both subject and structure. Wright is capturing its rhythm of its coup, and it allows it to organize the poem's movement. It is recurrent, it is cyclical, it is an elegy. There are also the title's double meaning. The full snow moon refers to both the February full moon and the idea of fullness and completion, contrasted with loss and emptiness. The moon is full. The land is empty of its original people. I thought that this was a delightful and heartbreaking collection. So this reminds me of Marie Howe's poetry. There's a poem that she wrote, and it is What the Living Do. And Marie Howe, I love her poetry. I have a number of her books on my shelf. And she just won the Pulitzer this year, which is lovely. I'm so happy for her. But it reminds me of Amy Wright's poem. There's a poem called What the Living Do by Howe. And they have such similar conventions. So I'll read What the Living Do, and we'll see how it goes. What the Living Do by Marie Howe. Johnny, the kitchen sink has been clogged for days. Some utensil probably fell down there. And the Drano won't work, but smells dangerous, and the crusty dishes have piled up, waiting for the plumber I still haven't called. This is the everyday we spoke of. It's winter again. The sky is a deep, headstrong blue, and the sunlight pours through the open living room windows because the heat's on too high in here and I can't turn it off. For weeks now, driving or dropping a bag of groceries in the street, the bag breaking, I've been thinking, this is what the living do. And yesterday, hurrying along those wobbly bricks in the Cambridge sidewalk, spilling my coffee down my wrist and sleeve, I thought it again, and again later, when buying a hairbrush. This is it. Parking, slamming the car door shut in the cold. What you called that yearning, what you finally gave up. We want the spring to come and the winter to pass. We want whoever to call or not call, a letter, a kiss. We want more and more and then more of it. But there are moments, walking, when I catch a glimpse of myself in the window glass, say, the window of the corner video store, and I'm gripped by a cherishing so deep for my own blowing hair, chapped face, and unbuttoned coat that I'm speechless. I am living. I remember you. that is Marie Howe's poem, What the Living Do. It uses white space in a very similar way that Amy Wright does on the page. There are breaks so that we can understand what they're saying. There are breaks on the page. There are caesuras. There is space for us. And I think that is where I'm going to stop, because it's so profound, and we need to allow ourselves to accept that. There is space for us on the page. There is space for the reader. There is space for you. There is space for us. When you read, you are invited on the page. You should get this chapbook. It's on BainbridgeIslandPress.com. It's one of our chapbooks. I was so delighted to read it. I am sorry that this is almost half an hour of talking about this poem. It's lovely, and I hope that you enjoy it. I hope that you love it. I hope you read all of the poems. They're touching, and I'm just so glad that I was invited to read them. So thank you. Okay, party people, that is all for today. If you've enjoyed diving into the world of verse with us, join us next time. We've got more poets to meet, more poems to explore, and more literary adventures to share. Until then, keep reading, keep writing, and keep poetry close to your heart. Thank you for joining Poetics Podcast, where we bring poetry to life, one verse at a time.